Hello everyone, I'm Tony Damian.
And I'm Andrew Rich, and welcome to the latest episode of Himalayan Bites. And today we are joined by our new Tax M&A partner, Jay Prasad. Jay, welcome.
Thanks, Andrew. Great to be here.
And it's great to have you here. Today we're going to be talking about dividends in the public M&A context, and specifically special dividends. Now these can help bridge a value gap and give a little bit of extra value to the target shareholders to encourage them to do the deal. But as with everything in tax, there are issues with it. Some of those issues are substantive, some of them are mechanical. Jay, why don't we start with some of the mechanical things that you need to be aware of here, because it's always, for me, making sure they get the franking credits is a key issue.
Yes, absolutely. So from a tax perspective, there are a few mechanical points to work through. Most of these are reasonably well understood and settled, but as a refresher, first, it's important that the company has sufficient standalone profits, which are available to pay the special dividend, and those profits are recorded in properly prepared accounts of the company. There are, of course, also related Corporations Act requirements which need to be ticked off. The company must also have sufficient franking credits to pay the special dividend. Companies will typically model franking credits which are expected to be generated or consumed in the lead up to the payment of the special dividend, and that can help mitigate against the risk of the company's franking account going into deficit because of the payment of the special dividend. The final mechanical point, I think, and one that you both will be very familiar with, relates to the scheme timetable. So for target shareholders to qualify for franking credits, they need to satisfy certain holding period rules. Where you have a special dividend which reduces the scheme consideration, which is otherwise payable to shareholders, and that sort of happens in most cases, but not all cases. The ATO generally require shareholders to satisfy a stricter holding period rule, which requires them to hold their shares at risk for a clear 45 days prior to the ex-dividend date. So when it comes to the scheme timetable, to allow shareholders to satisfy this rule, you will typically see a clear 2 days between the dividend record date and the scheme record date. There are, of course, other nuances when it comes to the scheme timetable, including when foreign bidders are involved, but that's usually the one that's focused on.
Yeah, lots to consider in the scheme context for dividends. The other ones we see, Tony and I, Jade, that we have to deal with are the loans. Quite often there's not enough cash in the target to pay for the dividend, and in such cases the court will want to be satisfied that the loan's not coercive to shareholders, or it's not going to create a problem or a disincentive for rival bidders to emerge. And that old chestnut of financial assistance often gets a run. Thankfully, the courts have taken a fairly pragmatic approach to that, so that's not so much an issue these days. But on the loan front, that's obviously a tax issue as well. Can you just explain some of the tax issues that these loans from the bidder to the target can give rise to?
Yes, the funding of the special dividend has always been an important factual matter when it comes to tax. Where the dividend is bidder funded, the ATO will generally say that the special dividend forms part of the taxable proceeds for the transfer of the target shares. Now, the tax anti-overlap rules generally operate in those circumstances to ensure that the dividend is taxed only once, but it can be particularly problematic in the context of scrip-for-scrip rollover acquisitions, where the dividend can be subject to tax 2 times, first at the time of receipt and then indirectly when the replacement shares issued by the bidder group are subsequently sold by the shareholder, and that is because the tax cost of those replacement shares are reduced by the special dividend. Again, that's a technical position which is relatively well understood by the market, but the funding of special dividends has come into renewed focus more recently, and that is for a different reason. I think many of our viewers would be well aware that the government in the last 12 months or so introduced a new tax integrity rule for equity funded dividends. Now, in a public M&A context, the equity rule, this particular integrity rule can apply where 3 conditions are satisfied. First is that the target does not have an established practice of paying special dividends, usually the case. Second is that there is an issue of equity interests by any entity at any time, so a really broad capital raising requirement. And then the third is that it is reasonable to conclude that the principal effect and a non-incidental purpose of the issue of the equity interest was to fund the special dividend. So the nexus requirement. Where the integrity rule applies, shareholders can be denied some or all of their franking credits, and the company can be left with a withholding tax liability for dividends paid to foreign shareholders. So it's a very broad integrity rule, and it can very much apply in this context.
Yes, one to certainly watch out for, that integrity rule. What would your couple of tips be for those embarking on a scheme when you're mentioning the integrity rule? What should we be thinking about? Yeah,
so there are a couple of scenarios or examples where this particular integrity rule can apply in a public M&A context. So one that comes to mind is where you have a bidder agreeing to fund the special dividend by providing the target an interest-free loan. And that interest-free loan is convertible into equity at the election of the bidder. We saw something similar a few years ago in the Zenith Energy scheme of arrangement. When you look at that instrument, you think it's legal form debt, so you wouldn't naturally think of it as an equity interest. But because of the convertible feature of that instrument, the tax rules are likely to characterise that instrument as equity. So assuming you have a target which doesn't have an established practice of paying special dividends, you have an issue of an equity interest and you're likely going to satisfy the nexus condition here. So the integrity rule would likely apply. Another example that comes to mind is where you have the bidder group capitalising a new subsidiary, which regularly happens to undertake the acquisition. I think the key sensitivity there would be ensuring that the capitalised monies are not used by the target to fund the special dividend or otherwise used to sort of refinance or replenish the funds that are used by the target to pay the special dividend. So it's a very broad integrity rule, and because of how broad it is, it does have the potential to apply to deny franking credits for target shareholders because of post-implementation actions by the bidder. And so in the last 12 months or so, what we have seen is a practice developing of including additional bidder representations and undertakings in the scheme implementation deeds and agreements to help the target manage this risk.
And tax, I think of tax, I always think of the ATO somewhere in the equation. How does the engagement with the ATO work in relation to these issues, Jay?
Yes, so I think most viewers would be aware that target companies usually apply to the ATO to confirm the tax treatment of special dividends by way of a class ruling on behalf of shareholders. This process can take a few months, so we usually recommend early engagement with the ATO so that that process can run in parallel to the broader scheme timetable. In the last 6 months or so, we have seen the ATO publish their first set of class rulings following the introduction of this equity-funded dividend integrity rule. What we have seen is target companies choosing to fund their special dividends through surplus cash reserves and existing debt facilities. What we've also seen as part of ATO engagement processes is the ATO asking more questions about recent capital raisings. So I think it's important for companies to start thinking about, in the lead up to that process, have they had any recent sort of capital raisings in the past 5 to 6 years? How were the capital raised? How were the funds raised, deployed in the business, and whether any nexus can be established between those funds and the funding or the payment of the special dividend.
So maybe the advice for companies is just randomly along the way pay some special dividends here and there, just in case that takeover bid comes in with a special dividend in tow.
Thank you very much, Jay. A lot to consider there on the special dividend front. Thank you.
And we look forward to you joining us in our next episode of Himalayan Bites.